It wasn't long after the wedding that Catherine's past began to catch up with her. She'd had a previous affair with a man named Francis Derham, a gentleman-at-arms in her grandmother's household. Much of the court knew of this previous fling, but Henry seemed completely unaware. In August of 1541, Catherine made Derham her secretary, likely a bribe to keep him quiet about their relationship and to keep a close eye on him. Even with all this happening in the background, Catherine still seemed secure as ever with her position. In the spring of 1541, Henry fell seriously ill with a fever, and Catherine was sent away for her own safety. It was around this time that Catherine began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman at the king's privy chamber who she had fallen in love with before taking up her post as a lady-in-waiting. A letter written from Catherine to Culpeper in April of 1541 showed that the pair were very much romantically intertwined, and were likely also lovers. A side note about Thomas Culpeper, he was not a great dude. Though a gentleman in status, he was anything but. He had brutally raped a park keeper's wife, which he succeeded in doing by ordering 3 of his servants to pin her down as he attacked her. He also murdered a villager who had tried to save the woman. I'll take tittle scumbags for 500, Alex. He had been pardoned by the king for these offenses, but they tell us quite a lot about his character. We know for certain that Catherine cared for Culpeper, but it is possible that he merely saw her as a potential sexual conquest and a stepping stone to greater power and influence at court. When Henry recovered from his fever, the king and queen departed for a royal tour through the north of England. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham both traveled with this tour as members of the royal household. Rumors began to circulate that Catherine may be pregnant, which proves that Henry still made love to his wife on a somewhat regular basis at this point. Catherine had an overly simple view of marriage. As long as she and the king were happy, nothing else mattered. This allowed her to continue her dalliances so long as the king remained ignorant of them. Over time, Catherine became increasingly open in her affection toward Culpeper. This made Culpeper very nervous. As a gentleman of the privy chamber, he knew how tumultuous the king's moods could be and was not prepared to risk his neck for Catherine. There were others at court who knew of the ongoing relationship, but the traveling court was not nearly as steeped in gossip as a settled one. When the northern tour finally ended on November 1st, 1541, word of the queen's infidelity spread through the court like wildfire. Much like her ill-fated cousin before her, Catherine Howard's fall from grace was swift. News of the Queen's past and current affairs were brought to the attention of the Archbishop of Canterbury by John Lascelles, a man who was threatened by the growing power of the conservative Catholic faction. The Archbishop broke the news to Henry on November 2nd, 1541, by passing him a letter with the charges against Catherine. Henry had been so thoroughly deceived by his wife that at first he thought the letter was a forgery. He ordered the Archbishop to keep the matter quiet and began a private investigation. It only took a few days for the truth to come to light. Not only was the Queen promiscuous, but she was not a virgin when she married the king. Several of Catherine's female servants were arrested and sent to the Tower of London as part of the investigation, as was her former lover, Derham. Under torture, Derham confessed to his previous relationship with the Queen and identified Thomas Culpeper as her current lover. Likewise, Culpeper was swiftly arrested and tortured, and he too confessed to his relationship with Catherine. When the news of the confessions reached Henry, his confusion quickly gave way to extreme anger and self-pity. He blamed everyone but himself for his latest romantic disaster. Catherine Howard was arrested on November 12, 1541, and locked in her rooms at Sion House, at which time the Archbishop interrogated her. She was understandably terrified and hysterical, convinced that she would be executed like her cousin before her. It's noted that even as he interrogated Catherine, the Archbishop felt pity for her in this fearful state. Catherine may have been able to argue legal grounds for her life to be spared and their marriage to simply be annulled, but she had no legal counsel to support her, and it's unclear if the cuckolded Henry ever intended to spare her life. Catherine was demoted from her position as queen on November 22nd, and 2 days later, she was indicted for leading, quote, an abominable, base, carnal, voluptuous, and vicious life, unquote. On December 10th, 1541, Francis Derham was executed for treason in a most horrific way. He was hung, drawn, and quartered, which involves being disemboweled and castrated while still conscious. Thomas Culpeper was executed that same day, though he was sentenced to the much more merciful execution by beheading. The leniency toward Culpeper may have been due to his higher rank and personal service in the king's household. Their heads were set on spears atop London Bridge and remained there for the next 5 years. Yikes. Catherine remained imprisoned at Sion House for 3 months, during which time many of her relatives were sent to the Tower. On Friday, February 10, 1542, after Henry succeeded in passing legislation declaring it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king, the Duke of Suffolk arrived to take Catherine to the Tower of London. Catherine became hysterical and had to be physically forced aboard the barge as she struggled. On Sunday evening, she was informed that she would be beheaded the next day. Catherine's only request was that the execution block be brought to her so that she would know how to place herself upon it. This would be her last act, and she was determined to die with as much dignity as possible. The execution was carried out on Monday, February 13, 1542. Catherine was so frightened and weak that she had to be helped up the stairs to the scaffold. She made a quiet speech in which she prayed for the king's preservation and God's forgiveness. The execution was quick. Catherine's body was entombed at the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Catherine Howard was only Queen of England for 18 months. While she had no major impact on English history, bearing no children and making no serious political plays, hers is a tragic story of a reckless young woman who never truly understood the dangers and burdens of wearing the crown. We can only wonder if she would have grown and matured with time if her life had not been cut short. Catherine was only 20 or 21 years old when she was executed. In the final years of his reign, Henry grew mopey, obese, and increasingly paranoid of those around him. For the first time in years, Henry did not have a future bride waiting in the wings for him. In the meantime, the Tudor court continued to teeter between the opposing factions of the Reformed faith and Catholicism. Everyone waited anxiously for Henry to choose his next wife, knowing full well that her religious views would tip the balance in favor of one party. The position of queen was the greatest honor that could be bestowed on an Englishwoman, but in the later years of Henry's reign, it had also become the most dangerous honor. With Henry's track record, what woman would be willing to risk marrying such a temperamental ruler? Still reeling from the humiliation of Catherine Howard's infidelity, Henry was determined that he would never be cuckolded again. In the same legislation that had condemned Catherine Howard to death, Henry included a clause stating that if the king married a woman who turned out to be less than pure and virtuous, the charge of treason would apply to the woman herself and, quote, all who knew it and did not reveal it, unquote. In other words, speak up or die. This new law sent chills through the entire English court. In earlier days, parading an attractive young woman before the king was seen as a chance to advance the family's fortune and standing. Now, it was seen as a death risk. Could you even really be certain of a young woman's virginity? And what about false rumors? And, most critically, could the judgment of a paranoid king be trusted? The entire court breathed a sigh of relief when Henry set his eyes on Catherine Parr, a 31-year-old twice-widowed lady of the court. The fact that Catherine was a widow put her family at ease as well. There would be no need to prove her virginity since the king was well aware of her romantic history. As to which religious faction would win out in the English court, Catherine was a humanist and supported the Protestant reformers. Though Catherine was twice widowed, she was still 20 years younger than the king. She was described as being vivacious and witty, yet sensible. Catherine Parr was most likely born in 1512 and was the eldest child of Thomas Parr of Kendal and Maud Green. Maud Green had served as a lady-in-waiting for Catherine of Aragon and had named her daughter after the queen. So Henry's final wife was named after his first wife. How's that for a mind F? Catherine's father died when she was young, and her mother dedicated herself to arranging good marriages for her children. Catherine received some education as a child, but it was by no means comprehensive. She would carry a love of scholarship with her throughout her life, and would later take on the arduous effort of learning Greek and Latin. Catherine's first two marriages were to men much older than herself. Toward the end of her second husband's life, she began visiting her younger sister Anne at court, where Anne served as a lady-in-waiting to Henry's fourth and fifth wives. This time at a court opened Catherine's eyes in many ways. For the first time, she was in the company of healthy, vibrant men her own age, and, unlike her aging husbands, these men were charming and flirtatious. With this said, there was never a hint of impropriety on Catherine's part, and she continued to lovingly nurse her ill second husband during this time. As her husband drew near the end of his life, Catherine began to daydream about what her future could hold. She would soon be a wealthy widow with the freedom and means to enjoy her youth. Around this time, she fell in love with Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour and uncle to Henry VIII's only male heir. However, it was during this same time that Catherine caught the eye of the king himself. Henry sent his first gifts to Catherine on February 16, 1543, a full year after Catherine Howard's execution. Anyone else getting the feeling that Henry VIII just really didn't know how to be single? Catherine's second husband finally passed away on March 2nd of that same year. Catherine Parr was now free to build a future with Thomas Seymour as her husband and enjoy a life of passion rather than one of duty. However, Seymour wisely took notice of the king's interest in Catherine and stepped back. Once again, Catherine Parr took the course of duty, entering into her third marriage with an older, infirm husband. Poor woman can't catch a break. Catherine and Henry's relationship moved quickly. The couple were married just a few months later on July 12, 1543. The ceremony took place at Hampton Court Palace with all the royal children present. Ever the dutiful woman, Catherine chose the motto, "To be useful in all I do." For all intents and purposes, the marriage was an immediate success. Catherine was incredibly endearing and garnered genuine affection from all those around her. For Henry, she was a loving companion and nursemaid. To Henry's children, she was a caring stepmother. Catherine Parr was the only wife other than Catherine of Aragon to be made regent of England while Henry was away on a military campaign. This shows the level of trust and respect that he held for his wife. The one topic that Catherine and Henry butted heads over was theology. Catherine was a strong proponent of the New Age idea of making the biblical text available to the masses in English. Henry and Catherine's detractors feared that this would lessen Henry's power as the supreme head of the Church of England, since it would encourage his subjects to think for themselves. Catherine made the mistake of lecturing her husband on religion when he was in a terrible mood from his ulcers and recurrent headaches. The king sent word that Catherine would be arrested for heresy, but the queen managed to submit herself to Henry and apologize for questioning his authority before it was too late. The king's health began to decline in the spring of 1546. He had been plagued by oozing, pus-filled boils on his legs for over a decade, and possibly suffered from gout as well. By the following winter, he was gravely ill. Ever the dutiful wife, Catherine continued to nurse and care for her husband to the very end. King Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547, at the age of 55. After Henry's death, Catherine married her former suitor, Thomas Seymour. 6 months after her marriage to Seymour, and a year after the death of Henry VIII, Catherine became pregnant. This was a shock to the 35-year-old Dowager Queen, who had never conceived in her first 3 marriages. During her pregnancy, Catherine discovered that her husband was fond of her stepdaughter, Lady Elizabeth, who would become Elizabeth I. There were rumors that he had planned to marry Elizabeth before he ended up married to Catherine. As a result of these rumors, Elizabeth was sent away by her stepmother, and the two women would never see each other again. Tragically, Catherine Parr died on August 30th, 1548, just 8 days after giving birth to a daughter, most likely from childbed fever. Her daughter was named Mary. Poor Mary would grow up without either of her parents, as Thomas Seymour was beheaded for treason after plotting to put the Protestant Elizabeth on the throne. So who ultimately inherited the throne from King Henry VIII? 9-year-old Edward VI succeeded his father as king at the time of his death, but Edward died just 6 years later, possibly of tuberculosis. Mary I inherited the throne after her half-brother's death. She only ruled for 5 years before dying in 1558 of uterine cancer or some other problem with her reproductive system. She spent her reign passionately steering England back into the Catholic fold, and the executions that marked her pursuit of the restoration of Catholicism earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, inherited the throne from her half-sister. Elizabeth was the longest reigning of the Tudor monarchs and re-established her father's religious reforms after Mary I's death. And so ends the tale of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. This wraps up our 2-part series on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check out the Salacious History page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @SalaciousHist, that's SALACIOUSHIST. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help to get the word out about the show. This podcast is researched, written, recorded, edited, produced, and marketed all by me. So please, show me some much-needed love and support by partnering with me on Patreon.com. If you have corrections, funny stories, or ideas for future episodes, you can email me at salacioushistory@gmail.com. I'm Sarah Duncan. See you next time.